They say the house always wins, that the game is rigged. But in 1931, the game broke. One specific number hit, and for the first time, asterisk, everyone times had it. The payout was mathematically impossible. The bankers? Bankrupt. The streets? In chaos. No gunshots. No sirens. Just a silent financial massacre that brought the underworld to its knees. Because on this day, the house didn't just lose. It collapsed. To understand the catastrophe, you first have to understand the landscape. You have to understand Harlem in the 1,930 seconds. Down on Wall Street, the ticker tape had stopped. The Great Depression had brought the legitimate American economy to its knees. Banks were shuttered. Factories were empty. The promise of the American dream had evaporated. But uptown, in the streets of Harlem, there was a different economy. And it was alive. They called it the numbers. They called it policy. But those are just names for what was, in reality, the heartbeat of the neighborhood. See, that's the thing about poverty. When you have nothing, hope becomes the most valuable currency you own. And the numbers game sold hope for a penny. It was simple, deceptively simple. You pick 3 digits, any 3 digits. You put down your cent, your nickel, your dime, and if your number hit, the payout was massive. It was enough to pay the rent for a year, enough to buy a car, enough to feel, for one moment, like a king. For a community that had been systematically shut out of the traditional banking system, this wasn't just gambling, it was survival. The New Yorker didn't just call it a racket. They looked at the devotion of the players, the daily rituals, the absolute faith in the system, and they called it something like a cult, a substitute religion. People didn't just guess numbers, they divined them. They looked for signs in their dreams. A crash on the corner? Play the license plate. A death in the family? Play the date. It was a superstition that generated millions of dollars in cold, hard cash. And the people running it? They weren't just gangsters. In the middle of the Depression, the numbers bankers were the only institutions that functioned. They were the ones lending money when the white banks downtown wouldn't let a black man through the door. They were the pillars of the community. The entire social structure of Harlem rested on the back of this illegal lottery. Think about that. In a time when men were standing in bread lines for hours just to get a stale loaf, people were scraping together pennies to give to the numbers runner. That isn't just a habit. That is desperation. That is a community holding its breath, waiting for a miracle. It was a perfect machine. A financial engine built on the law of averages. The system worked because the players were scattered. Everyone had a different dream, a different lucky number, a different superstition. The math guaranteed that the bank always collected more than it paid out. It was a fortress made of paper slips, seemingly invincible to the economic collapse happening everywhere else. The stock market had failed. The government had failed. But the numbers? The numbers were supposed to be the one thing you could count on. The house was supposed to represent stability until the math turned against them. At the top of this pyramid, there wasn't a mob boss in a silk suit. There was a woman, Stephanie Street Clair. On the streets, they didn't call her Stephanie. They called her Madam Queen. See, in the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, for a black woman to simply exist was a struggle. To build a financial empire? That was impossible. But Street Clair didn't care about what was possible. She cared about what was profitable. She looked at the desperation of the Depression and saw a business model. She constructed an organization that rivaled any corporation in downtown Manhattan. It was a machine. A perfectly calibrated engine of cash. At the bottom, you had the runners. These were the foot soldiers, the guys moving through the barbershops, the beauty parlors, and the tenements, collecting pennies and nickels in frantic bursts of activity. They were the veins of the system. Above them were the comptrollers. These were the accountants, the middle managers, sitting in back rooms filled with cigarette smoke, tallying the slips, balancing the books, ensuring the math always favored the house. Street Clair ran it all. She was the brain. She was the CEO of the underground. She amassed a fortune while the rest of the country was standing in breadlines. But in Harlem, success puts a target on your back. When you're making that kind of money, you don't just need accountants. You need insurance. You need a wall between you and the wolves. Enter Ellsworth Johnson. They called him Bumpy because of the knot on the back of his head. But to everyone else, he was simply the enforcer. History.com lists him as Street, Clair's right-hand man. But that title doesn't do him justice. He wasn't just an employee. He was a weapon. Bumpy wasn't a brute. That's the mistake people made. They saw the violence and missed the intellect. He was a strategist who understood the physics of power. He knew that to protect a queen, you had to be willing to do the things a queen couldn't do. He carried a switchblade. He carried a shotgun. But mostly, he carried a reputation. A reputation that said if you touched a single runner, if you messed with a single comptroller, you weren't just breaking a rule. You were signing a death warrant. The dynamic was perfect. Street Clair was the sophisticated architect, the one who understood the numbers. Bumpy was the street-smart general, the one who understood the blood. It was a partnership built on a simple, terrifying calculation. She made the money. He made sure she kept it. Together, they established a hierarchy in Harlem that felt untouchable. They weren't just criminals. They were the establishment. They were the bank and the law enforcement wrapped into one. But even the best strategies have a breaking point. Even the strongest enforcer can't stop a tidal wave. And neither of them knew that a single number 527 was about to test everything they had built. August 1931. A humid morning in Harlem. The air is thick, not just with the summer heat, but with something else. Anticipation. 9 a.m. The machine is in motion. On Lenox Avenue, inside the crowded barber shops, men are whispering. In the back of the bodegas, women are counting out pennies from their grocery money. The runners are making their rounds, moving fast, collecting the slips. White slips, yellow slips, each one a contract, each one a prayer. Usually, the bets are scattered. 1,000 different guesses for 1,000 different dreams. That's how the system works. That's how the house stays standing. The law of averages is the only wall protecting the bank from bankruptcy. But today, the law of averages is about to be repealed. 10:30 a.m. The bets are pouring in, and the comptrollers, the men counting the slips in the back rooms, start to notice a pattern. A terrifying pattern. It's not a scattershot today. It's a convergence. One number is appearing over and over again. 5, 2, 7. Maybe it was in a dream book that everyone bought. Maybe it was a hymn number at Sunday service. The reason doesn't matter. What matters is the volume. 527 is heavy. It's overloaded. The comptrollers start sweating. They call the bankers. "We have a problem," they say. "Too much action on 527. But it's too late to lay off the bets. The books are closed. The money is locked. Now, all they can do is wait for the clearinghouse totals. To understand the tension, you have to understand the payout. The odds in Harlem weren't 2-1. They were 600-1. If you bet a dime, you expected $60. If you bet $1, you expected $600. That's a year's salary in 1931. 2:30 p.m. The number drops. The clearinghouse totals come in. The digits align. The winning sequence is announced. It should have been a celebration. For a moment it was. Cheers erupted from the tenement windows. People danced on the stoops. They had beaten the system. They had finally caught the white whale. But inside the banks, inside the offices of the most powerful people in Harlem, there was dead silence. They did the math. And the math was a catastrophe. The payout liability wasn't just high, it was impossible. If they paid everyone who held a slip for 527, they wouldn't just empty the safes. They would have to sell the furniture, the cars, and the buildings. The collective payout was larger than the liquid cash reserves of the entire Harlem underworld. 4 p.m. The runners didn't come out. The streets went from jubilation to confusion, and then to anger. People were waiting for their money. But the money wasn't coming. The Black Wednesday crash had begun. One by one, the independent bankers, men who had been pillars of the community for a decade, closed their doors. They defaulted. They were insolvent. The trust that held the cult of the numbers game together was shattered in a single afternoon. And this is where the tragedy shifts. Because a bankrupt banker is a desperate banker. They needed a bailout. They needed cash, right now, to pay off the winners and save their lives. But the banks downtown wouldn't lend to them. The government wouldn't help them. There was only one group of people with enough liquid cash to bail out an entire neighborhood's gambling economy. The mob, the white syndicates, the very people Clair and Bumpy had been keeping out. Dutch Schultz didn't have to kick down the door. He didn't have to invade. On Black Wednesday, the door was unlocked from the inside. The financial collapse did what no gun could do. It forced the independent kings and queens of Harlem to look for a savior, and what they found was a shark. While Harlem was suffocating from the financial vacuum of Black Wednesday, a predator was watching from across the Harlem River. His name was Arthur Flegenheimer, but the world knew him as Dutch Schultz. If Stephanie Clair was the elegant CEO of a shadow corporation, Dutch Schultz was a rabid dog off the leash. He was the beer baron of the Bronx. During Prohibition, he had flooded New York with illegal alcohol, building a kingdom on violence and intimidation that even the Italian families found distasteful. But by the early 1932s, the beer business was turning sour. The feds were circling. The legal fees were astronomical. Schultz was rich on paper, but he was starving for liquidity. He needed a stream of cash that didn't require trucks, warehouses, or breweries. He needed money that flowed like water. And then he looked uptown. Why Harlem? Because that's where the cash was. Schultz saw the numbers racket, and he didn't see a community survival mechanism. He didn't see the cult of hope that the New Yorker described. He saw a disorganized pile of money being guarded by people he considered inferior. The racism wasn't just a character flaw. It was part of his business strategy. In the eyes of the white syndicates, the black bankers of Harlem weren't colleagues. They were placeholders. They were keeping the seat warm until a real gangster showed up to take the table. The contrast between the two worlds couldn't have been sharper. Clair ran her business on loyalty and community standing. If a runner was arrested, she paid the bail. If a player won, she paid the slip. It was a system built on trust. Schultz ran his business on terror. He didn't start with a meeting. He started with a massacre of the infrastructure. He sent his men into Harlem not to negotiate, but to break. They intercepted the runners' old men and teenage boys and beat them unconscious in the alleyways. They smashed the windows of the confectionery stores that took the bets. They pistol-whipped the comptrollers. The message was simple, brutal, and typically American. Pay the protection fee or bleed. Schultz calculated that the Harlem bankers, already weakened by the payout crash of Black Wednesday, would fold immediately. He expected them to run to him for protection, handing over a percentage of their empire just to keep breathing. He was the wolf entering the henhouse, and he had the teeth to prove it. But Dutch Schultz made a critical error. He looked at the ledgers, but he didn't look at the people. He assumed that because they didn't have the backing of the Italian Commission, they were defenseless. He assumed that violence was a language only he knew how to speak. He didn't know that by attacking the numbers, he wasn't just attacking a criminal enterprise. He was attacking the only bank the people of Harlem had left. And he didn't know that standing between him and the Queen was a man who didn't care about the beer baron's reputation. A man who had been waiting for a war just like this. The war for Harlem didn't look like a war. Not at first. There were no battle lines drawn in the sand. No declarations signed on parchment. There was just the sudden, violent intrusion of metal into flesh. Dutch Schultz sent his soldiers into Harlem with the confidence of an invading army. He had the numbers. He had the heavy artillery. His men carried Thompson submachine guns and drove reinforced sedans. They were used to the open streets of the Bronx, where they could spray a storefront with lead and drive away before the glass hit the sidewalk. They expected the numbers bankers to roll over. They expected fear, but they forgot who they were fighting. Bumpy Johnson knew he couldn't win a conventional war. He looked at the math. If he lined up his crew against Schultz's army in the middle of 125th Street, they would be slaughtered in minutes. A switchblade can't argue with a machine gun. Not at a distance. So Bumpy changed the distance. He turned the architecture of Harlem into a weapon. The narrow alleyways between the brownstones. The rusted fire escapes that zigzagged up the tenement walls like iron veins. The coal chutes that dropped straight into pitch-black basements. This was his terrain. He knew which floorboards creaked in the boarding houses. He knew which rooftops connected to which. Schultz's men would walk into a building to collect a protection payment, heavy with arrogance, their guns bulging under their coats. They would walk in 3 deep, and maybe, if they were lucky, one would walk out. The tactics were brutal, primal. It was guerrilla warfare fought in stairwells and telephone booths. Bumpy's crew didn't use guns unless they had to. Guns were loud. Guns brought the police. Instead, they used knives, ice picks, garrotes. Silent weapons for a silent war. Picture the scene. A Schultz enforcer steps into a hallway. The light bulb above him has been unscrewed. It's dark. He hears a sound behind him, a footstep on the linoleum. He spins around, reaching for his holster. But there's no one there. Just the shadows. His heart starts hammering against his ribs. He turns back to the door, and that's when it happens. The flash of steel, the pressure on the windpipe. No scream, just the thud of a body hitting the floor. Schultz was losing men faster than he could recruit them. And the psychological toll was worse than the body count. His soldiers started refusing assignments in Harlem. They called it a ghost town. They said the shadows had eyes. Bumpy Johnson was everywhere and nowhere. Time magazine and historical records describe him during this period as the principal enforcer, but he was more than that. He was the dam holding back the flood. He moved Stephanie Street, Clair from safe house to safe house, orchestrating the defense like a chess master playing for his life. Schultz tried to escalate. He put a price on Bumpy's head. He sent hit squads with specific orders to kill on sight. But every time they cornered him, the landscape seemed to shift. Bumpy would vanish down a laundry chute or across a fire escape, leaving only a mocking laugh or a booby trap behind. It was David versus Goliath. If David was a 6-foot gangster with a straight razor and a genius-level IQ, Schultz had the money. He had the political connections downtown. He had the brute force. But in the tight, suffocating streets of Harlem, brute force was clumsy. It was slow. Bumpy was fast. And he was bleeding the Dutchman dry. The beer baron was burning through cash. Every dead soldier required a funeral payment. Every bribed cop required a thicker envelope. The easy money Schultz had come for? It was gone, replaced by a war of attrition that he was slowly, painfully losing. He had come to shear the sheep, but he had found the wolf. The 23rd of October, 1935. Newark, New Jersey. The Palace Chop House. Dutch Schultz sat at a table in the back. He wasn't looking at Harlem anymore. He was looking at a plate of steak, unaware that the Italian Commission, the real power behind the American Mafia, had already voted. They had decided that Schultz was too loud, too violent, too much of a liability. At 10:15 p.m., two men walked into the restaurant. Charles, the Bug Workman, and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. They didn't use knives. They didn't use shadows. They used a rust-pitted .38 and a sawed-off shotgun. The thunder lasted less than 45 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the beer baron was slumped over the table, bleeding out on the linoleum. But he didn't die immediately. And this is where the story turns into a nightmare. For the next 22 hours, as police stenographers sat by his hospital bed, Dutch Schultz descended into a fever delirium that has haunted criminologists for decades. He didn't confess. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He spoke in riddles. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 Kim. French-Canadian bean soup. Mother is the best bet. And don't let Satan draw you too fast. The police transcript reads, like poetry from hell. It was the sound of a mind fracturing under the weight of its own violence. At one point, he whispered, "I am a pretty good pretzler." And then finally, silence. The wolf was dead. Back in Harlem, the news didn't bring celebration. It brought relief. The pressure valve was released. But amidst the quiet, one man was still standing. Bumpy Johnson. He hadn't pulled the trigger. He hadn't needed to. He had simply outlasted the storm. He had held the line long enough for Schultz's own ambition to kill him. And when the dust settled, the Italian families came to a new understanding. They realized that Harlem couldn't be conquered by force. It had to be partnered with. So they made a deal. Clair stepped back, retiring with her fortune intact, a feat almost unheard of in the underworld. And Bumpy? Bumpy stepped up. He became the bridge between the Italian mob and the black community. He became the Godfather. The war that started with a single number, 527, ended not with a bang in Harlem, but with a whisper in a Newark hospital. And the man who was supposed to be the victim, he was now the king. But kings don't retire. They get exiled. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics didn't care about the peace treaty Bumpy brokered. They cared about a narcotics conspiracy charge. And so they sent the King of Harlem to the one place where his influence couldn't reach. Alcatraz. The Rock. For over a decade, Bumpy Johnson was inmate #117. He was locked in a concrete box suspended in the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by the most dangerous men in America. History.com lists him among the infamous inmates of the prison, right there with Al Capone and the Birdman. But while Capone rotted away from syphilis, Bumpy stayed sharp. He played chess. He read history. He waited. He watched the seagulls through the bars and plotted his next move, assuming the board would be exactly how he left it. That was his mistake. The federal government shut down Alcatraz, and Bumpy was paroled. He walked out of the prison gates, 57 years old, gray at the temples, but still dangerous. He boarded a train back to New York, expecting a homecoming. He expected the parades. He expected the respect. But when he stepped onto the pavement of 125th Street, the silence was deafening. The Harlem of the 1,930 seconds, the Harlem of Stephanie Street Clair, and the numbers game was gone. It had been erased. The policy wasn't the main engine anymore. The game had changed from pennies and hope to white powder and despair. Heroin had arrived. The Italian families, the sons of the men Bumpy had made peace with, were no longer treating Harlem like a partner. They were treating it like a colony. They were flooding the streets with narcotics, bleeding the neighborhood dry in a way that the numbers racket never did. The code of honor? The idea that a gangster had a responsibility to his people? Dead. Buried under a mountain of addiction. And the energy on the street? It wasn't just fear anymore. It was rage. The civil rights movement was burning hot. Malcolm X was preaching on the corners, demanding dignity and revolution. The young men weren't looking up to gangsters in suits. They were looking up to activists in spectacles. Bumpy stood there, a man out of time. He was an analog king in a digital world. The young hustlers on the corner didn't bow. They barely glanced at him. They didn't know about Black Wednesday. They didn't know he was the reason they weren't speaking German or paying tribute to Dutch Schultz. To them, he was just an old man in an outdated suit. It was the ultimate alienation. The world he had fought to protect had evolved into something he barely recognized. The rules had changed. The players had changed. And for a moment, it looked like Bumpy Johnson was finished. But they forgot one thing. The game changes, but the nature of power is constant. And Bumpy was about to remind everyone why he was the one who survived Alcatraz. To the FBI, he was a cancer. To the newspapers, he was a menace. But to the people of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was complicated. Biography.com records that he was often referred to as Robin Hood. In the underworld, benevolence isn't just charity, it's strategy. Bumpy understood that a king needs a kingdom that actually wants him there. So, come Thanksgiving, he wasn't hiding in a penthouse. He was on the street corners, handing out turkeys. He paid the rent for widows. He bought gifts for children who had never seen a brand new toy. It created a shield that no bulletproof vest could match. When you feed the neighborhood becomes your eyes and ears. You become part of the fabric of the street. By 1965, the police understood this. They knew they couldn't turn the people against him. So they decided to break him psychologically. They initiated a campaign of lockstep surveillance. It was suffocating. If Bumpy went to a restaurant, a uniformed officer stood by his table. If he went to the barber, a squad car idled at the curb. It was designed to provoke a reaction. They wanted him to lash out. They wanted him to reach for a weapon. Instead, Bumpy reached for a chair. In one of the most stranger-than-fiction moments in criminal history, the Godfather of Harlem walked right into the local police station. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a gun. He marched into the middle of the precinct, sat down, and refused to move. It was a sit-down strike. Imagine the scene. The most feared man in New York, sitting calmly in the headquarters of his enemies, demanding his civil rights. He told the desk sergeant he wasn't leaving until the harassment stopped. He turned the tactics of the civil rights movement against the NYPD. The police were paralyzed. If they beat him, they would trigger a riot outside. If they did nothing, they looked weak. Eventually, they formally arrested him. The charge was refusal to leave a police station. It was a desperate, flimsy charge, and Bumpy knew it. When the case went to court, the judge didn't see a mob boss. He saw a citizen being harassed by the state. He acquitted Bumpy Johnson. The verdict was a humiliation for the police department. Bumpy walked out of that courtroom not just a free man, but a legend. He had beaten the law at its own game. He had proven that he wasn't just a gangster with a gun. He was a tactician who could weaponize the very laws meant to put him away. The 7th of July, 1968. Wells Restaurant. It's a Sunday morning in Harlem. The air smells of syrup and fried chicken, soul food, comfort. Bumpy Johnson is sitting at a table, ordering the same thing he always does. He is 62 years old. He isn't looking over his shoulder. He isn't checking the reflection in the window for a hitman. For the first time in 40 years, the Godfather of Harlem is just a man having a meal. He is talking to his waitress. He is smiling. And then, it happens. There is no thunder, no tires screeching, no shattering glass, just a sudden clutch at the chest, a gasp, and then The king falls forward. Biography.com confirms the cause. Heart failure. The irony is almost cinematic. The man who survived the Black Wednesday crash, who outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz, who survived the razor-edged politics of the Italian Commission, and who walked out of Alcatraz alive, wasn't taken out by a bullet. He wasn't taken out by an enemy. He was taken out by his own heart. When Bumpy Johnson died on that floor at Wells, an era died with him. He was the last of the Titans. He represented a time when organized crime in Harlem operated with a twisted kind of nobility. He was a murderer, yes. He was a criminal, absolutely. But he was also a stabilizer. He operated by a code. He believed that even in the underworld, there were rules. After him, the rules evaporated. The structure he built was dismantled. The gentleman gangster was replaced by a new generation that cared only about volume and violence. The heroin epidemic that Bumpy had tried to navigate, and some say, contain, finally broke the dam. The streets he fought to protect became a war zone, not of strategy, but of chaos. So, as we look back at the wreckage of the 1,930 seconds and the turbulent 60 seconds, we are left with a difficult question. The history books will call him a gangster. The FBI files call him a sociopath. But if you talk to the old-timers on 125th Street, they tell a different story. They tell you about the turkeys on Thanksgiving. They tell you about the rent payments. They tell you about a man who stood tall when the rest of the world wanted him on his knees. Was he a predator who fed on his community? Or was he a necessary monster, created by a system that offered no other path to power? In the end, Bumpy Johnson proved one thing. In a world of shifting alliances and treacherous numbers, respect isn't given, it is earned. And he earned it until his final breath. If you think Bumpy Johnson was the smartest operator to ever walk the streets of New York, hit that like button. It helps us keep these files open, but I want to hear from you. In the comments below, answer me this. If you were living in Harlem in 1931, watching the banks fail and the wolves circling your door, would you have viewed him as a hero or a villain? Make your choice. And don't forget to subscribe. We are digging into the archives to find the stories that history forgot. The next file we're opening? It involves a heist that makes Black Wednesday look like pocket change. I'll see you there.